My fiancee is behaving strangely again. By the Cold People. Last month, my fiancee Faye and I went up to her parents' cabin in Pikes Peak, Colorado, and had a set of extremely weird and terrifying experiences. We found an old dream catcher on a tree in the woods out back, and at night, we heard a series of unsettling voices from the forest. At first, we thought it was someone messing with us, but then, the voices, they began to take on recognizable traits. We heard Faye's grandfather calling out for help. He's been dead since 2012. And we heard my mother laughing. She lives over 700 miles away. Faye got sick and began to talk in her sleep. And at one point, the voice of a woman outside began to repeat some of the things that Faye was mumbling, as though they were communicating. I documented the experience here, and I received overwhelming support from fellow Redditors, and thousands of people got involved with helping us out. Everything was going really great. That is, up until a few nights ago. I'm sorry I haven't posted about this matter in a while, but Faye and I have been trying to forget, especially with her weird sleep disorder. The best course of action for us is to just try to bury what happened and move on with our lives. The more upset or stressed out she becomes, the more she sleepwalks and sleep talks. And that's where the scary things happen. For those of you who haven't read my prior stories, my fiancée has suffered from extensive sleep disturbances since she was 5. She has night terrors and she's an accomplished sleepwalker. At the request of several Redditors, I interviewed her, so you can hear all about her weird experiences. Long story short, some sort of entity became fixed on her while we were at the cabin in Colorado, and it made several attempts to coax her out into the woods. When those attempts failed, it came after me next. It followed us to our home in California, and would try to get into our house at night by communicating with Faye, while she sleepwalked. We were both exposed to whatever it was, to the point where it made us physically ill. My friend Nathan essentially forced us to puke our guts out on some spiritual purging process. Although I wished he told me because we wouldn't have destroyed our living room carpet. We thought it was over, and Faye went back to normal and returned to her playful, funny self. She got her strength back, and not just physically, but the strength of her personality returned as well. She had been feisty and won't put up with any of my shit. Which was a great sign that she was feeling better. She's been wearing her engagement ring too. It hasn't left her finger since we got back. But 2 nights ago, weird shit started to happen. I absolutely dread writing this because I know paying attention to it, I risk exacerbating the situation. The part of the carpet where we had lost our lunch is permanently stained and rather dark. All because I couldn't afford to get a decent carpet cleaner out in time. We were watching, crying through the new Game of Thrones on Sunday. Faye pointed out the stain looked in the shape of a man. It was about 3 feet long, and basically looks like some 2-dimensional troll. We made some Rorschach jokes about it, then went to bed. I rolled over in the middle of the night trying to put my hand on Faye's back, and for a second, I touched that empty space on the bed. 1,000 horrible thoughts rushed through my head. Faye hasn't sleptwalked since things settled down, and I feared that this was an omen that our visitor had returned. I found her downstairs. She was sitting in the dark, spine straight in front of the TV. It was off, her eyes were closed. But she was running her fingers over the stain on the carpet, whispering to it, giggling. I raced over and threw the lights on, foregoing my rule of never waking her up abruptly from a bout of sleepwalking. I just didn't want this to be happening again. I couldn't accept it. I shook her awake and she said, "How could I forget?" When she came to, she had no idea where she was. She seemed unusually upset that I had woken her up, as if she were in the middle of a very good dream, but then appeared to be frightened when I told her what was happening. I asked if she remembered anything, but she said no. I can't tell if she lied to me or not. On her way upstairs, she inexplicably vomited all over the wall. It was the same dark brown, black color as when Nathan poisoned us. At this point, I was completely freaking out. I tried to keep my cool and help Faye get into bed, and I got her some water. I made sure she was alright. She was absolutely fine and couldn't explain why she had vomited. Then, I shut the light off, closed the bedroom door, and spent a half an hour trying to clean that goddamn wall off. I've mentioned in my previous post that I'm an emetophobe, so cleaning vomit is basically the worst form of punishment I can imagine. But something distracted me from the horrid stench. No matter how hard I scrubbed, the stain would not come out. And it too had splattered in the rough shape of a man. Because of the fact that Faye was standing halfway up the stairs and barfed down the wall, this stain was much, much larger than the one on the carpet, almost 5 feet tall. When I finally got in bed, Faye was still awake. She was kind enough to give me a really nice shoulder rub as I laid there in a heap. I was nauseated and tired. She tried to reassure me, but we both knew what was happening. Whatever it is, it's fascinated with her. It's back, or it never left. I don't know how long we sat there talking, but eventually I just passed out, Faye laying in my arms. She said a few more things in her sleep, but I could never quite catch him. I was just too tired. The next day, I tried to reach out to Nathan, but he wasn't answering his phone. I had to work, so I didn't see Faye all day, and I got home before she did. So I spent several hours jumping at every sound outside while I was grading my students' final papers. When she did get home, she said that she had felt sick all day and just wanted to go to sleep. So she went upstairs, showered, and then got into bed. Around 10:30 p.m., I shut off my laptop and headed upstairs. Faye was sitting on the bed, feet on the ground, staring out the open window into the woods across the street. I gently laid her down and rubbed her back until she snored. That's the only way to guarantee that she won't get up for a long time. And then I inspected the entire house. I don't know if I'm just freaking out, I'm tired or what, but the vomit stains, they seem bigger now than they were before. I'm calling a guy tomorrow to come do a professional cleaning, and I'm pissed because I know I'm going to get stuck with a $200 bill for the job. I checked the backyard and didn't see anything. Then I made sure the front door was locked and all the windows were sealed tight. The last window I checked was the one in the guest room, the one on which Faye had drawn the number 5 backwards while sleepwalking. I stood there for a long time. It was late and dark, and all these memories of the last month kept cycling through my mind over and over. I felt dizzy and sleepy, almost hypnotized. It was a strange feeling, that a mixture of relaxation and terror. Now, I can't explain to you why I did this, but without even thinking about it, I reached out my hand and lazily drew a backwards 5 on the window. And in that tiny little moment, I saw something move behind the trees across the street. Faye abruptly burst into sleep laughter from down the hall. As I walked back to the bedroom in the dark, I could hear her giggling the entire way. Nothing else to report for now. It's 10:31 p.m. on a Tuesday as I write this, and I'm going to sleep. I'll update if there are any new developments. I really and truly pray there aren't any. A lot of Redditors have mentioned that since I retrieved Faye's ring from that creepy dream catcher, it's possible that it's been cursed. After all, the ring was given back to me. It could be what's causing all these new disturbances around the house. So Faye and I decided to make the long trek back to Pikes Peak, from whence the evil ring came, and destroy it by throwing it into the mine at the top of the mountain. We gathered a fellowship of 7 people to help us on this journey. Just kidding. But seriously, there's a lot of people speculating that the ring is now the problem. I am taking this into consideration, but Faye, she's not willing to part with it right now. And seeing as how she just got it back, yeah. But if the entity seeking Faye did curse the ring and did get me to break the dream catcher to retrieve it, it's even more clever than I could have anticipated. More on this if I decide to make a move. We had a professional carpet cleaning service come out yesterday and try to tackle the puke stain situation. The guy told me over and over, that's not vomit, I can get vomit out. It took him a long time and he managed to get most of the stain out of the carpet in the living room, and he recommended we get checked out at a hospital. I told him that we already had. Some parts of the carpet are still spotted and ruined. He gave me a discount. The drywall in the stairwell is another story. The guy took one look at it and said we needed to paint it, but I insisted the stain had to be removed before doing so. He told me to strip and sand the drywall, or he would come back and do it on his day off for a small fee. I told him I'd take care of it. He made some exorcism joke and left. I was not amused. Faye came home very excited yesterday. She'd gotten a promotion at her job. We celebrated by going out to dinner at our favorite steakhouse. She ordered her normal meal, thank God, and had a few drinks. I didn't drink at all, so I was the DD for the evening. When we got home, she pretty much went right to bed. And on the way up the stairs, she drunkenly said, "Fuck that guy," and pointed at the stain at the wall. That night, I had a very strange dream. I dreamed that I was trying to scrub the stain off the wall, like I had a few nights ago. But this time, I was scrubbing in the dark. The moonlight was barely seeping through the window and illuminating the outline of the stain, which looked more like a man than it did before. I loomed over it as I crouched on the stairs. But then, something weird happened. The wall underneath the stain turned mushy, like oatmeal, and gave way to my hand. My arm went right through the drywall. I pulled it out and there was a faint light coming through the hole. I pushed more and more of the squishy wall out of the way. It crumbled and flopped to the floor on the other side. At last, I cleared a hole big enough to squeeze through. It led to a familiar place. I realized where I was the second I stepped in. It was freezing cold, even in the dream. I was in the cellar of the cabin, where I had found all those jars and that hair, where I had found the pieces to make more dream catchers. I felt instantly afraid, and turned around to go back into my house, but the wall was just sealed shut. The only way out of the cellar was through the open panels at the top of the wooden staircase, leading to the outside. The snow was falling down onto the stairs. I remember seeing something on the ground behind one of the shelves. I picked it up and instantly recognized it as its importance. It made me feel like I understood everything better. But before I could see what it was, I was woken up by Faye. We were still in bed. She was sitting up against the pillows, running her fingers across my neck and back. She was looking down at me, smiling. But her hair was dangling in such a way that it obscured her face a little, and the moon lit her up from the window behind her. So she looked kinda different. I recognized my fiance's hair and body, but her face looked old and withered, like an old man's. At that point, I noticed that her hand felt different too. It was rough and heavy like a guy's. It took me a second to realize that she was probably asleep, so I sat still and just watched her. A few moments of this and she abruptly got out of bed and walked towards the door, mumbling to herself about that sound again. I followed her quietly, wondering what she was going to do. She walked through the hall, never searching for the light switch, and stood at the top of the stairs. She started whisper arguing with something down there in the dark, like when a couple bickers in public and they're trying to hide it. She said, "You need to leave. You need to get the fuck out of here and never come back." "I don't know any of them. I don't know anybody." "Is that you? Who's with you? Who's making all that noise? Are you just gonna stand down there and call my name all night? Well, why don't you come up here then? You think I don't know what you're doing? And then the last thing she said was, We don't know, leave us alone! She shouted it so loud it took me off guard and momentarily paralyzed me with fear. I rushed over and grabbed her before she could fall down the stairs. She told me to get off of her and that she didn't need any help, then brushed past me towards the bedroom. Along the way, she vomited, and I got to spend another hour to clean it up while she slept soundly. And guess what? New stain. It wasn't until writing this that I realized that the stain had been making its way closer and closer to the bedroom. This morning before work, I talked to Faye about what happened. She had no recollection of any of it, including barfing up our expensive dinner. But she did say that she heard several voices outside the house early this morning. She said there was a child calling out, "Where is she? Where is she?" and a man grumbling angrily. She couldn't make out his words. She also said that I kept talking in my sleep this morning, which is something that I almost never do. Faye agreed to seeing a doctor again because of the vomiting, and also mentioned to me that after reading the Reddit comments that hypnotism might be worth a good try, so we're looking for one in our town. More on that if anything develops. Also, her sister Becca is coming to visit in a few days and to see how things are. Becca lives in Arizona with her husband and her infant son. I've only actually met her a handful of times. It'll be nice having some extra people in the house for once. In other news, Nathan is still not returning my calls, so I might try the ranger station later tonight. I also want to let you all know that it's finals week, both for me as a graduate student and for the undergrad students I teach. I might not be able to update every day like I usually do, so if I go missing for a day or two extra, don't be alarmed. I am keeping a close watch on Faye. And I do have one last thing to report. Today at lunch, I put my head down in my office and I drifted off for a few minutes, which is unusual for me because I'm a chronic insomniac and I don't take naps. Ever. I had another dream. T-Way came to me. For those of you who don't know who T-Way is, he was a Native American who lived near Pikes Peak. He and his son, Nathan, blessed our cabin and helped me and Faye in our struggle last time. He died in the woods under mysterious circumstances during my last night in the cabin. In the dream, I was looking out of our bedroom window, and T-Way was standing at the tree line across the street. It was really him, not the creature that did the horrifying impersonation of him. He was pointing into the forest. I think I'm supposed to go in there, I guess. I don't know whether I can trust my own dreams or not anymore. That's where the imposter hides. Edit. I just got out of work literally 30 minutes ago, and I got a call from Faye's boss. I'm on their emergency contact list. They sent her home for behaving erratically. I'm on my way home now. Sorry for the wait, no sleep. I really do appreciate your concern. I can't even begin to describe how busy I am right now. Faye's older sister Becca and her son Caleb are here, staying in the guest room. It's finals week for my students, so I'm hosting tons of meetings with them. And I've only gotten one of 3 major projects done for my doctoral advisor. And I'm grading a huge stack of essays. Oh, and something is trying to steal my fiance's skin or mind control her into killing me or something. So yeah, it's pretty busy around here. How are you? Where did we leave off? Oh yeah. Friday morning. My ass hadn't even warmed the seat in my office before I got the call from Faye's boss, notifying me that Faye had been acting erratic. Erratic, in fact, to the point that they sent her home from work. Apparently she stood in an open doorway of one of the storehouses, just staring into the darkness within, not moving for several minutes. A coworker tried twice to get her to snap out of it, but she didn't. A few minutes later, the boss came over and found Faye inside, standing in the shadows, looking out. It was pitch black inside the storehouse, so when the boss flipped on the lights, she found Faye standing in the corner, just smiling up at her, eyes unfocused. A few seconds later, she came right out of it and went back to work. An hour later, my fiancé allegedly claimed that she could feel eyes on her while she was working and had to go inside the break room and sit down. Her coworkers found her fast asleep and just left her there, thinking she was hungover or sick, and then they went to lunch. When they came back, Faye was sleepwalking in large circles around the perimeter of the room, singing a lullaby. This scared the other employees so much that they got the park manager to actually drive her home. They didn't trust her to drive. Now Faye has to take a drug test because they think she's on drugs. Hopefully, she's completely clean. When I got home, I immediately took Faye up to urgent care, who miraculously got us in a reasonable amount of time. We explained everything. Everything. I thought the doctors were going to think we were completely insane, but both of them actually just looked scared shitless. After a CAT scan, a blood panel, and several other tests, they concluded that Faye was healthy, but she needs a full psychiatric evaluation. They gave us a referral and we made an appointment, but it's 2 weeks out. We'll have the blood panel back sooner. When we got home, Faye took a nap, and I went into the woods across the street from our neighborhood, where I saw T-Way in the dream. For those of you who aren't caught up, it's pronounced T-Way, and we still don't know how he died. I wandered around between the trees trying to figure out if there was something I needed to find. For about 10 minutes, I searched around and found nothing. But then I remember the phrase that many of the voices at the cabin kept repeating. Up in the trees, down in the hole. You go up in the trees, or all the way down, down, down. So deep, you never see the light again. There were so many variants of that phrase, I can't remember them all. But I looked up in the tree and voila. There was a crudely constructed object made of twigs and twine, dangling from a branch about 30 feet off the ground. It kind of looked like the dream catcher that we found at the cabin, but it was obviously made of twigs and out of the tree from which it dangled, so it was a different color and shape. I climbed the tree and tried to retrieve it, but it was so frail that it fell apart the second I pulled it towards me. One thing stood out about it in particular. It had strands of fiery strawberry blonde hair dangling off of it. Just like Faye's. I need your opinions on this. As far as I know, Faye cannot climb trees. But then again, apparently there's a lot I don't know about Faye. My fiancée went out around 7 p.m. to go pick her sister Becca up from the airport. She insisted that I stay home and rest. I think she feels bad about how often she sleep deprives me. I reluctantly obligated. They came home around 9 o'clock, and with them was Becca's son, Caleb. I know nothing about babies, but Caleb is pretty cool. He cries less than my students do, and he's smarter than half of them. And Faye absolutely adores him. Becca and I caught up over hot chocolate in the living room, while Faye unleashed the full scope of her maternal instincts upon Caleb upstairs. She sang lullabies, laughed, cooed, basically went full mommy crazy. I know that when Becca leaves, I'm gonna have to deal with Faye crying and wishing we had kids already. Becca is tough as nails, just like her sister. And it comes from being raised in a strict military family. But having a strict dad also teaches girls how to be expert liars. And I got the sense that Becca was selling me all sorts of bullshit when I told her about what we went through at the cabin. Becca was about 5 years older than Faye, and has already been married twice. She has a 10-year-old daughter with her first husband. She claims that she only went to Pikes Peak once. She said that the drive made her carsick, so whenever her parents went up there with Faye as a little girl, she'd stay over at a friend's house instead. She told me that she had no idea what the number 5 meant to Faye, and dodged me like a minnow when I pressed it. I get the overwhelming sense that she is deeply troubled by Faye's behavior, and not just because it's creepy, She knows something she's not telling me. Faye's entire family seems to be keeping me out of the loop on something big. A very tech-savvy Redditor offered to help me track down Jennifer, and he delivered. When I checked my email that night before bed, he had provided me with an email address and a phone number for Jennifer's husband. She remarried after Tom hung himself. Tom was so deeply disturbed by his experiences at the cabin that he just couldn't take it, even after moving to Nevada. Or maybe he just couldn't take Jennifer. I emailed the guy, his name was William, and he got back to me the next day and asked me to call him. I explained the entire situation to him. He informed me that he and Jennifer had moved to Washington State years ago, but she had started abusing prescription medication a year into their marriage. And over the course of a few weeks, she repeatedly told William that she had heard her daughter, who died in childhood, calling to her from the forest outside their home. One night, when William got home from work, the back door was open and Jennifer was just gone. She left with her shoes and jacket. Jennifer went missing for almost 6 months. A group of campers found her remains over 40 miles away. Said she had been buried in the ground, with her legs sticking out, and they had been gnawed clean by wolves. That night, I woke up to the sound of a baby crying. Faye was gone. My first thought was that it was coming for her, because a few weeks ago, she had accurately mimicked the sound of a child crying while walking around the house at night. But this time, it was Caleb. I walked down the hall that led to the guest room and found the door open. Becca wasn't in there and the crib was empty. I followed the sounds down the stairs, walking past the barf stain on the wall. I'm gonna strip it today. And saw Faye and Becca sitting on the couch. Faye was cradling Caleb in her arms, staring at him, while Becca was babbling on and on about her husband. She didn't notice that Faye was actually asleep. And when Faye looked up at me, only the whites of her eyes showed. They were rolled back in her head. She was completely out of it. And then she smiled. I stood there for a second, just really disturbed at the scene, and didn't say anything. Suddenly, something moved outside of the sliding glass doors behind them. The door that leads to our tiny little garden. It was almost pitch black out there. But the black shape of a man, a huge man, moved away from the glass and vanished into the darkness. Someone had been standing there behind Faye and Becca, watching them play with Caleb. I took off out the front door, hoping to circle around and intercept the man. We lived in a housing complex, so the walkway goes behind all of the houses. The only thing separating it from the backyard is a tiny little wooden gate that you can literally step over. It's mostly to keep dogs and rodents out. But I ran up and down the path and found nothing. Nothing at all. There was, however, an oily black substance on the ground about 10 yards away from our back patio. Last night, Faye started mumbling more lullabies in her sleep. I'm guessing it's probably because she's been thinking about Becca and Caleb's visit, and she loves kids just so much. She also said, "He's in the stains. He gets up and walks around in the dark." I took the advice of a few Redditors and asked, "Faye, what did you forget?" She paused for a long time and then replied, "He needs me." Right when she said it, a child laughed somewhere outside. Tomorrow, the Shoshone woman who visited us last month is going to come back with her friend who specializes in hypnosis. I will report the results when I can. Again, please forgive me if this takes a bit longer. This week is a nightmare. Update. Finally got a call from Nathan. More to come soon. So, last time I updated, Faye's older sister Becca came to visit with her infant son Caleb. The presence of a child seems to have awakened something in Faye, because her sleep disturbances became even more erratic. and her unusual behavior was just intensified. They stayed for almost a week, but left abruptly after a few weird experiences with Faye. Becca seemed to be growing angry with Faye over the course of a few days, although I could never really discern why. One night when Faye was asleep, Becca and I sat on the couch and talked about what was happening. I asked her why she seemed so hostile towards her sister. She wouldn't even speak to her that day. Becca replied that Faye really has a problem letting things go. If she's mad at someone, she's mad for weeks. If she's hurt for years. She can't forgive and she cannot forget. I asked, did you do something to make her mad? Are you two fighting? Becca denied that there was any sort of conflict. She said that she was speaking in general terms, having grown up with Faye. I asked her if there was something in the past that made Faye angry, and Becca sharply responded, nobody did anything to Faye. Nothing happened to her. At that point, she stood up and went upstairs, claiming she needed to check on Caleb, and closed the door without even saying goodnight. Faye is sometimes difficult to handle because she's proud and stubborn, and the strongest person I've ever met. But her sister, she's like an obsidian wall. You cannot get any information out of her. You can't read her poker face. You can't know what she's really thinking, ever. But I know that she knows something. Maybe I can get it out of her, I don't know. But I'd figure I'd be able to get it out of her mom. Becca and Faye's mom, Laura, agreed to Skype chat with me this week. This time, I am going for the throat. I've successfully removed all the vomit stains in the house, so Faye isn't talking to them in the dark anymore. But she's still getting worse. I feel like she's just slipping away. Seeing Faye hold Caleb on the couch with her eyes rolled back and smiling was one of the most disturbing memories I have of this entire ordeal. There's something about Faye and that child that deeply unsettles me. I've been keeping quiet and trying to make sure that Caleb is safe. I have no reason to believe that Faye would do anything to hurt another person, except for that one time in college when she punched a drunk girl at a party for grabbing my ass and saying I'd hit it. But as far as animal and kids go, Faye is simply angelic. The night that Becca stormed off mid-conversation, Faye did something odd. I woke up to her mumbling in the dark, and when I turned on the light, I saw her standing at the far end of the room, cradling a pillow in her arms, and swaying back and forth, kind of half singing a lullaby. The words were unrecognizable, but the melody sounded distinctly familiar. I called out to her and said, "Sweetie, what are you doing?" She replied in a low, grumbly voice, "I always wanted to be the big sister." Her speech was slurred. She sounded drugged. I got up and gently ushered her back to bed and took the pillow away. And when I did, she said, "Now I want to be a mommy." I rubbed her neck and assured her that we would start a family one day, and that she would be a great mom. She then mumbled, "He's a little corpse." I asked what does that mean, and she never replied. She just started that rhythmic breathing that lets you know your partner is fast asleep. Angela visited our house again the next evening, just after the sun went down. For those who don't recall, Angela belongs to the Shoshone tribe in California. She is the daughter of a very important tribal leader. She first visited me and Faye when we got back to California, and told us that a malevolent spirit called the Hollow One was infatuated with my fiancé. She said that there was a dark cloud over Faye that could not be easily removed. This time, Angela brought her friend, who was a hypnotist. They inspected the house and the yard. We told them about the barf stains, and Faye's claimed that he was in the stains. He gets up at night and walks around in the dark. Then, in private, I told them about the baby's presence and how it exacerbated Faye's behavior. I also showed them where I found the new dream catcher. Angela said the entity has many names, and it's known to several different Native American groups. It is older than the Skinwalkers, and that it is the progenitor of many evil spirits that inhabit different places near the Rocky Mountains and in the Southwest. Her friend referred to it as a soul trader that snatches up a person's essence, then takes that down into the dark. Then it enters the remaining body to seek out more victims. I don't know where the dark is, but allegedly that is where Faye is heading. With too much exposure to this thing, both Faye and I have become tainted by it, which is why we were vomiting that dark bile, and the stains carried remnants of the evil. Angela spoke with Faye for a long time, and concluded that it was still Faye, but on her way to somewhere else. She's making a spiritual journey to a place that she thinks is good and safe. But in reality, she's just being coaxed out of this world. Despite what's happening to us, a lot of this whimsical metaphysical talk, it's sometimes hard for me to swallow. But the hypnotist session with Faye did a good job in convincing me that there is something here, inside the house with us, always watching. The hypnotist had Faye lie flat on our bed, and we brought chairs up from the dining room to sit with her. She put her hand on Faye's forehead and hummed a chant for a while, then covered Faye's eyes with her palm and asked her a few questions. They were things like, "What is your name? Who is your fiancé?" All of Faye's answers were normal. The hypnotist then hummed some more and then lifted her hand. Faye's eyes were rolled back in her head, which only happens when she's in a sleepwalking state. Her mouth was twitching a little bit too. The hypnotist asked, "Who are you?" And she responded, "I am Faye." The important bits of the conversation went something like this. "Faye, can you tell us who's in the house?" Faye raised her arm slowly and pointed at each person in the room and said their name, even though she wasn't even looking at them. She knew where everyone was. Felix, Becca, Angela, you. And then she pointed at the wall and said, "Caleb. He was in the other room." The hypnotist asked, "Is there anyone else? What about the man who's been following you?" She shook her head and said, "Right now, he's outside." We all glanced outside the window to the tree line where I had first seen the figure walking back and forth in the middle of the night, mimicking Faye's sleepwalking. This time, there was no one there. Angela asked, "What does he say to you? Is he talking to you right now?" Faye replied, "I can't hear him. He's facing the other way." The hypnotist asked, "What are the dream catchers for? Who makes them?" Faye did not respond. She just smiled a bit. I butted in and said, "Honey, I found your hair wrapped in the dream catcher outside. Did you do that?" She put her finger up to her lips and shushed me. Then she put her palm flat against the wall, like she was feeling for a pulse. After a few minutes, she said, "He's here." Right when she finished her sentence, Caleb burst into tears. Becca and Angela rushed out of the room to go check on him. The hypnotist and we remained with Faye. The hypnotist finally went for broke and said, "Faye, sweetie, you wrote the number 5 on a window in the other room. You wrote it backwards. Why did you do that? What does it mean? Did you write it for someone outside to see?" In that moment, Faye's eyes rolled forward. Her little green irises finally showed. She immediately looked toward the door into the hall and said, No, he's listening now." And then she began hyperventilating and struggled to speak the words, "He'll find out." The last thing she said was, "Felix," in a deep guttural voice. It definitely wasn't her own. Then the hypnotist pressed her hand against Faye's eyes and spoke a loud command in her native language. I think it was Shoshone, but I'm not exactly sure what group she's affiliated with. Faye immediately woke up. She seemed very confused on where she was and then started crying and reached out for me. I hurried over and held her in my arms. Her body was so cold. It was like she was a corpse. When she was crying, she said, "He wants to kill you. He wants you dead. I saw you in the trees." Angela and the Hypnotist, I haven't given her name by the way because I don't want you to have to memorize a million names. We hurried around the house, blessing it and burning sage, then also recommended that I call a Catholic priest for Faye's personal comfort, since she is a Catholic. They left after a few words of parting. Becca seemed really angry and scared at this point. She remained in her guest room for the rest of the night. I got a call about an hour later from Angela. She told me that she had discussed the situation with the Hypnotist, and they believe Faye is in extreme denial about something. Perhaps some sort of trauma. They said she had repressed it so well that it was consigned to a place in her subconscious that only years of therapy or hypnosis could unearth it. It was a place in her mind that can't even be accessed by talking to her in her sleep. That is where the number 5 rests. And that's why the entity hasn't found it yet. Despite communicating with Faye in her sleep virtually every night, he's been drilling her brain like a miner digging for gold. And the fun, it didn't end there. We all went to sleep pretty early that night because of all the drama, but as I've learned on so many other occasions, going to sleep upset usually results in night terrors or some other sleep disturbance for Faye. At about 2 a.m., she leapt out of bed, jolting me awake in the process, and bombed down the hall like there was a fire. She started bashing her fist on the guest room door, but didn't utter a single word. Her eyes were shut. I flicked on the light and stood there in the hall for just a second, scared completely stiff. When Caleb started to cry, I snapped out of it and rushed over. I bear hugged my fiancée to try to get her to stop making so much noise, and in return, she tried to bite me. Faye has never been violent towards me in her life. Even in her sleep, she was a very passive sleepwalker. Creepy, but passive. This time, she tried to rip my throat out. She was trying to draw blood. I fended her off and sort of apprehended her. I walked her back to the bedroom. She was basically wearing me like a straitjacket. When I carefully put her back into bed, she whispered, "You'll go up in the trees. You went down in the hole." Becca was understandably furious the next day, but she swallowed her anger and drove Faye down to the Catholic church in the town center. I went to work. Apparently, they finally got one of the priests to agree to a visit next week to bless the house. They explained that this wouldn't be enough, so he'd have to speak with the bishop of the diocese. That could take a while. This evening, Becca informed me that she changed her flight and now she intended to leave in 2 days. I begged her to set aside her differences with Faye to help get through to her. I said Faye needs her big sister right now, but Becca, she wouldn't budge. She seems to be holding on to a monolithic grudge about something neither of them will tell me. I ordered pizza, Faye's favorite, in a lame attempt of lightening the mood around the house, but the two would only have casual, light conversation with each other. The tension in the house was so thick, I could feel it in my stomach. Faye and I retired to our room early to watch Game of Thrones in bed. We always recorded it on Sundays because Faye's at work. Then we would watch it during the week. I asked her if she remembered telling me about the imposter wanting me dead, or that I would be put up in the trees. She said that she didn't recall any of it, but she did have a dream about seeing me impaled on a tree branch high up in the air. She said my skin and hair were missing. Faye fell asleep pretty quickly, but I couldn't sleep at all. I remember that Nathan, T-Way's son, had left me a voicemail a few days prior, and I'd forgotten to call him back. So I grabbed my phone and went downstairs. The house was quiet. Becca and Caleb were already asleep upstairs. I turned the TV on low to mask my conversation with Nathan. It was midnight in Colorado, but he still answered the phone. He asked me how everything was going. I told him everything. Nathan, he had a lot to say. He apologized for making me and Faye sick, but he said that the simple purging process was a very common treatment for many physical and spiritual maladies in his tribe. However, by my description of the barf stain events, it obviously didn't work, and we were still under the influence of the imposter. He said that if we came back to Colorado, he would bring us to the elders of his community and request that they perform a more serious healing ritual. I told him that that would be Faye's call entirely. I doubt she would go, or that the imposter would let her. Last month, when I was in the cabin by myself, there was a blizzard that shut down the only road to the mountain. The ranger couldn't come up to check on me, but T-Way and Nathan, being the badass gentlemen that they are, actually hiked up the mountain through the snow to check up on me. You can go back and listen to that story. But basically, on their hike back down, they heard Faye's voice calling out to them from one of the abandoned mines on Pikes Peak. T-Way went to investigate, and he was dragged into the dark by some unseen creature or animal. Nathan eventually found him dead. Parts of his skin had been flayed. The reason that I hadn't been able to get a hold of Nathan for several days was because he and a group of men from his community went back to Pikes Peak to investigate the circumstances around his father's death and to explore the cabin. They camped out for a few nights and eventually spent one night in the woods next to the cabin. Nathan heard T-Way's voice calling out for help over and over. He was crying and calling Nathan's name. However, occasionally the voice would cut out to Zuni, which is a language that some of the Pueblo tribes speak, but their tribe does not. They speak Hopi. So Nathan was fairly certain that this was not, in fact, his father. They also heard children weeping in the forest. One of Nathan's friends left the tent to take a piss, and he claimed that he saw a naked child with grayish skin standing a dozen yards off, facing away, looking up in the trees. He looked like a stiff corpse and was standing on the balls of his feet. This apparently scared Nathan's friend so bad that he took off. He grabbed his things and went to hike back down the mountain, in the dark, in the cold, by himself. Nathan and the others tried to stop him, but it was too dangerous to go after him. They haven't seen him since. Nathan told me that he had reoccurring dreams of a child while on the mountain. Of a child and of Faye. He said, "Tell me about the child, Felix." During our conversation, I had been standing in the living room facing the sliding glass doors, looking out into the backyard. Right when Nathan said, "Tell me about the child," I saw a large shadow move behind the orange trees outside. I told Nathan to hold on a second and went to grab the flashlight from the kitchen. When I got there, I almost collapsed in fright. The front door was wide open. From the front door, you could see the tree line across the street. Someone was walking behind the trees. I could see them slowly moving between them. I sat down the phone and ran upstairs to wake Faye and Becca, but Faye wasn't in bed. I frantically rushed to Becca's room to see if Faye was with her, but Becca was asleep. And she was really disturbed by my urgency when I woke her up. We turned on the light. She went to grab Caleb, but he wasn't in the little crib Faye had bought for him. He was gone. Becca turned into the Hulk in about half a second flat. She started shrieking in rage and terror, screaming, "Where is he? Where is my baby?" over and over. We dashed around the house looking for Faye and Caleb, but we couldn't find them. And that's when I realized she had taken him outside. We ran out barefoot straight to the trees. I came up behind Faye. My fiancée was standing there in her underwear looking up at the trees, her arms outstretched holding up Caleb off into the air, as if offering him to someone above. High up on one of the tree branches was the dream catcher, the one I had taken down and broken only days earlier. Now it was completely intact. Becca grabbed Caleb out of Faye's arms and shoved her to the ground, then took the baby back inside. I picked up Faye and rushed her back into the house. The neighbors were starting to come out of their homes with all the commotion. Faye woke up on our way back upstairs and she broke down crying, apologizing for scaring both of us. Becca packed all of her things and stormed out of the house, grabbing Faye's car keys and just drove off. The police showed up within a few minutes and I had to explain to them that the sisters had a big fight and it got taken outside. I said Faye was drunk, so she took it a bit too far and ran across the street. Thankfully, nobody saw the baby, so I didn't get arrested for child endangerment. What else could I have said? They would have never believed me if I told them the truth. They checked Faye out to make sure she hadn't gotten beaten up, asked repeatedly if I was treating her alright, then they left. Becca drove straight to the airport. Faye and I had to go pick up her car the next day. I've got a Skype chat scheduled with Faye's mom tomorrow. Becca texted me and said, ask her about the 5. She knows. If I can get an answer out of her, I'll post a brief update here. But I won't make another post for a while. I'm sorry. Thank you for all the support over this past time. Now, I need to try to put all the broken pieces of my life back together. I am so sorry for the length of this post. It is just enormous. I actually have to split it into 2 parts because of Reddit's word count limit. But this is it. For better or for worse, the end has finally come. After I post the other half of this update in a couple days, I will never speak of these events again. I've lost far too much, and it hurts way too deep to continue. It has been a long time since I talked about my fiancée and the events surrounding our vacation at her parents' cabin in Colorado. But I think enough time has passed. I have finally unearthed the secrets Faye's family has been hiding from me. No Sleep has been remarkably supportive, so even though what I'm about to tell you is deeply, deeply personal, you've helped us get this far. You deserve to know what I found. We moved about 2 weeks ago. I got a new job, so we found a place a few towns over. It's only an hour's drive from our old place, and it's the same distance from Faye's work, just in the opposite direction. As if by law of horror film cliches, the strange activity that plagued us at night ceased entirely for a week when we moved into our new place. However, it started right back up again after a while, just as I feared it would have. Our new home had not yet been blessed by Angela when the activity started up again. She is the daughter of a Shoshone tribal elder who saged and blessed our old home a few weeks prior. The imposter has not given up on Faye. Its game is to wear us down until we just give up. I had a Skype chat set up with Faye's very reticent mother, but per No Sleep warnings, I waited until after we moved. The fear was that Laura might divulge something over Skype that the imposter could use against us. The more it discovers about us, the more closely it can mimic me and Faye and her family members, living or dead. When she's asleep, Faye is highly susceptible to suggestion. The running hypothesis that No Sleep has developed is that there are certain things that the imposter needs to know about Faye in order to fully infiltrate her, to control her, to kill her. We don't know what it really plans to do with her though, but we do know that it is especially curious about the significance of the number 5, which Faye drew on the window while sleepwalking. She gets agitated anytime 5 is brought up, but cannot coherently explain why. I think that once it learns the meaning of the number, it'll have full access to Faye, and it'll be able to do whatever it's planning with her. I sat on my couch with my laptop and Skyped Laura around 10 p.m. one night at our new place, about a half hour after Faye had fallen asleep. I had to be extremely aggressive in order to break Laura's wall of lies about her family's past. And just when she seemed ready to crack, Faye walked out of the bedroom. We now live in a 1-story house. It was dark in the hall, so she scared the shit out of me when I saw the movement out of the corner of my eye. She stood there in the shadows, rigid and tall. Her entire body was stiff. Her head was cranked all the way back in a painful-looking position. Her chin pointed towards the ceiling. Her arms were straight up in the air in a hallelujah gesture. She hadn't sleptwalked in a while now, so I immediately told Laura I would call her back and jumped up. Faye shushed me and then wiggled her fingers, arms still outstretched. She looked like a praying mantis in the pose. I asked, "Faye, what is it?" She smiled and replied, "Did you know about her?" She closed her hands and one of the fingers pointed at the ceiling. I said I didn't know what she was talking about and asked, "What? No what?" I looked up at the ceiling and saw nothing. Faye paused. She typically pauses for long periods between sentences while sleepwalking. Then she said, "There's an old woman up there. She lives in the attic. She's so friendly. She remembered my birthday." My skin crawled. It felt like insects skittering under my clothing when she said it. Faye says a lot of disturbing things. I've grown used to it. But occasionally, she still surprises me. I asked her once more about this old woman, and she said, "She sleeps right over our bed." Faye brought her arms down at her sides and her muscles relaxed. She stopped answering my questions. I walked her back into the bedroom and gently tucked her in. That night, I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. I imagined the corpse of an old woman stuck inside the drywall or dangling from the rafters in the attic. I couldn't shake the feeling that our unwanted house guest had moved with us and was now pretending to be a friendly stranger just to trick Faye. That night, I dreamed of a dark stain spreading itself across the ceiling in the shape of a large man, just like the vomit stains on our old house a few weeks prior. As I was falling asleep, I thought I heard something heavy dragging itself around up there. Laura, Faye's mom, called me the following evening. Faye wasn't yet home from work, so we had a good hour-long conversation before things got uncomfortable. I had to spend a lot of time getting her back into that emotional space where she could open up about her daughter. And when she finally did, I was astonished. It felt like the first time Laura had ever told me the truth about anything. Now, I don't have proof that she was being honest, but I could hear it in her voice. It is true that when Faye was 5 years old, she developed her unusual sleep disorder. But the number 5 doesn't symbolize that. It goes a lot deeper. As I mentioned before in the previous updates, Faye's parents lied to me and told me that she had been visiting Pikes Peak regularly throughout her lifetime until she was 13. And yet, Faye claimed that she had never been there before. Ever. In reality, Faye went there a few times as a child, but her last visit was at age 5. She and her father Greg were outside building a snowman, and then Faye just kind of wandered off into the tree line and began speaking to someone that Greg couldn't see. She spoke her own name and said a few other things that Greg couldn't hear. And then she had some sort of seizure and became catatonic. When she came to, she cried for hours. But there was apparently more to the story. Just as Faye got home from work and walked in the door, I heard Laura say that a few months before that, I was pregnant. The second I covered the mouthpiece and said, "Hi, sweetie," Laura hung up the phone. I kept this revelation to myself for a while. Laura didn't return my calls after Faye went to bed, so I never found out what happened to her pregnancy. Did she have a miscarriage, an abortion? Did she give the baby up for adoption? Was it not Greg's child? A million questions swarmed my mind. I couldn't sleep at all. I could barely hide my thoughts from Faye. She knew something was wrong. She's quite perceptive and she can read me like a book. But I acted like I had a stomachache and went up to bed. That night, I had an absolutely terrible dream. Probably the worst one I have ever had. In it, an adult Faye attacked her pregnant mother. She was sleepwalking but screaming wildly and pummeling her mother. Just like she had pummeled the guest door when her sister and infant nephew, Becca and Caleb, visited us last month. There was blood everywhere in the dream. And then Faye ran off into the woods with the fetus. It was so violent I jolted awake, nearly screaming. When I woke up, Faye was sitting upright in bed, staring out the window. She was awake. I could tell because her posture was normal, and her eyes weren't rolled in the back of the head or blissfully sealed shut. She said, "Did you hear that too?" It took me a while to figure out where I was. When I saw her sitting there in a pristine white t-shirt, I sighed in relief. There was no blood anywhere. It was just a dream. But before I could answer her question, I heard a baby crying. We live in a bigger suburban neighborhood now, so it was entirely possible that it was just sound from one of the nearby houses. But Faye's reaction to it really disturbed me. The look on her face made me think that it was causing her physical pain. She cringed and shut her eyes, trying not to cry. I cupped her face in my hands and told her it was okay. But as I did that, another voice ran out in the darkness. It was a little girl, and she was speaking as if to a baby. From what I could hear, she said, "When do we go inside?" "Up in the trees?" "Where?" "Not in the hole. Not down there." Starting to cry. Faye started crying too. I looked out the window but couldn't see anything. She had no explanation as for why she was so upset, other than, "He's back. He's here. I know it's him." I didn't want to scare her, but I completely agreed. I missed a call from Nathan the next morning when I woke up. It was Saturday and Faye and I had plans to go get new furniture at IKEA. While she was in the shower, I returned Nathan's call. He answered on the first ring. He sounded terrible. The first thing he said was, "Felix, do you know anything about the child?" A few weeks prior, he had said, "Tell me about the child," and I had no idea what he was talking about. Now, I had a pretty clear idea. So I whispered to him that Faye's mother had been pregnant when Faye was 5, but I had no idea what became of the baby. He told me to get as much information from Laura as possible, at all cost, but keep it from Faye. He also told me that he was going to mail us a special herbal mixture to make in our tea before bed. He said that it promotes good dreams, and therefore would help shield us from some of the imposter's intrusions. I asked Nathan to explain what he meant, and he said very simply, "The imposter does not read minds. It reads dreams." This was an astonishing revelation to me. It explained so much about the cabin. The imposter mimicked Faye's grandfather because she had probably had a dream about him at the cabin, and it mimicked my mother for the same reason. It mimicked the people that Greg saw die in the war because he frequently had nightmares about it. The former owner of the cabin, Jennifer, heard her dead daughter's voice in the forest at night because she would regularly dream about her. Who wouldn't have painful memories of their own child passing away? The creature mimics the people it learns about through the dreams of its victims, and it repeats them in the forest to coax the victim outside. It also listens to the things people say while they're awake. This is why we heard so many unrecognizable but familiar voices at the same time. Some of those voices belong to other victims. That thing wanders around in the dark, learning from its targets, sharpening its skills, and pretending. This is how it hunts. Since we're getting nearer to the significance of the number 5, the information that the imposter so desperately sought, Faye was in greater danger. My own dreams could betray our safety. Nathan continued. I'm paraphrasing here because I can't remember everything verbatim. Faye is the most fascinating person the imposter has ever encountered. Her dreams are mysterious to it. She is a puzzle to be solved, and most of all, when it speaks through her dreams, she speaks back. I guess you could say it has a very dark fixation with her. Perhaps even love. A putrid form of it anyway. It was true. Faye mirrored the imposter's darkness. When it looked into her, it didn't find all the hopes and dreams and fears it saw in others. Instead, it saw a deep well of impenetrable blackness, and it knew that there was something hidden beneath it. Whatever it plans to do with the information that it seeks, it knows that 5 will light the trail to reveal what's at the bottom of that well, and everything inside of it. Cold sweat matted every inch of my skin during this conversation. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear as to not miss a word. I asked, why does it even need Faye to find the answer? Her parents probably know what the number means too. Nathan then said something in his native language, as though he were speaking to a person sitting in the room with him. Then he said to me, her parents haven't been to the cabin in a very long time, so its connection to them is weak. Maybe it can't keep a hold of someone for very long if they aren't on the mountain. After all, Faye has had her sleep disorder since she first went to Pikes Peak. As the years passed, the entity faded from her life. It only returned when she came back. I heard the shower shut off and the glass door slide open. Faye began moving around in the bathroom, so I walked outside onto the patio and closed the door behind me. But what does it want, Nathan? I asked him. I mean, once it learns everything it needs, what does it plan to do? Nobody will give me a straight answer. Again, Nathan said something that I couldn't understand. He definitely was talking to someone else. Perhaps one of the elders of his community were with him. It's one of the old evils, he said. Our people have believed in them since the beginning. When a person dies, they become a wraith, a haunting. But these entities were here long before. So many horror films Faye and I had cheerfully watched came flooding into mind. So, like a demon, I said? I can't tell you how many movies I've seen where a family finds out that the ghost in their house is actually a demon. And for a few obscure reasons, that's much worse. I felt like I was about to be given that speech. Nathan cleared his throat. Well, no, not exactly. We don't believe in hell or any equivalent place. Our interpretation of the other worlds is very complex. But basically, this type of entity, they take you away. Not your body, but your spirit. They take you out into the dark, away from this world and its light. So far away, eternities upon eternities away. The distance drives your spirit completely mad. And then you become one of them. That's what it does. It separates you from where you're supposed to go in the afterlife. It steals you from yourself. So, yeah, good news all around. I also asked Nathan how he was coping after his father's death, and I pointed out that he sounded especially dreary today. Again, I expressed my condolences and said that I was most honored to have known T-Way, and that we're alive because of him. Nathan replied that he knows his father's spirit lives on through the family, and in the sacred earth where they live, and for that reason, he doesn't mourn his death. However, Nathan also said something that made my hand go cold as I clutched the phone. He said, I keep having the same nightmare every night. It keeps me awake when it's over. I'm exhausted. I asked him to tell me about the dream, as I was having terrible ones lately too. He said, it's in the cabin. I can see it in my dreams. It's sitting there in the dark, and there's a bad storm. I'm standing in the distance looking at it. The lights turn out inside, and I walk towards it. As I approach, the front door slowly opens, and something in my heart tells me not to step inside, but I do. Every time I do. When I'm inside, the light cuts out, and it's very dark. From the living room, I can hear my father's voice calling to me from the bedroom. He's speaking in our native language. He sounds happy and peaceful. He tells me to come to him, and that he wants to see my face before he goes on with our ancestors. He calls me My Light, the nickname he gave to me as a child. But when I go to push the bedroom door open, I awake to the sound of a child crying every time. Nathan went on to explain that he feels these dreams are a sign that we must return to the cabin into the site of T-Way's death. I said it could be a trap, you know. In fact, I'm sure it is. Nathan spoke once more in his language to whoever was in the room with him, and then paused. He finally sighed and said, "You might be right, but it really feels like him." I made him promise not to go back to the cabin. He agreed, and said he would call me in a few days. I thanked him again for his father's sacrifice. A few days passed in relative peace. Laura didn't return my calls, and Becca, Faye's sister, didn't return my text messages. The standoffishness of this family just drives me insane. When Faye and I got home from grocery shopping one evening, a package had arrived in the mail. It contained the herbs that Nathan had talked about, with instructions on how to make the tea. "Not too much," read the little note. Faye brewed up some tea and drank it, and when she was finished, I jokingly told her that, "Actually, we're sending you on a vision quest. This is going to be really intense." She was not amused. We both slept soundly that night. No dreams, no strange activity outside, no weird noises, nothing. The next morning, there was a knock on the door, so light that it only woke me up. I'm a light-sleeping insomniac. I snuck out of bed and tried not to wake Faye up, and then I crept to the front door. It was Laura. She had come to our new home, totally unannounced and uninvited. I immediately knew that there was about to be a shitstorm. I couldn't begin to imagine what she was doing here, but I knew by the look on her face that it was trouble. I invited her inside and informed her that Faye was still asleep. She was actually relieved and told me that she wanted to talk to me alone. From her bag, she produced a photo album. We sat on the couch and she quietly apologized to me for everything. For constantly being evasive, for lying, and for letting us go to the cabin in the first place. I waved away her ramblings and demanded to know the purpose of her visit. I had absolutely had enough of all of this, and I wanted to get to the bottom of things. Laura dropped her voice to a whisper and opened up the photo album. As she turned the pages, I realized that it was actually a scrapbook. A very elaborate one, too. Must have taken years to construct. There were photos, drawings, designs, letters, postcards, even a necklace and some flattened flowers. I saw pictures of Faye that I had never seen before. She was absolutely adorable as a child. Her glowing smile poked out from beneath little strawberry locks in photo after photo. Laura said, "This is what I wanted to show you. I don't know how to talk to Faye about it." I was amazed. It took expert handiwork to craft something like this. "You made this?" I asked. She flipped further and further into the scrapbook and revealed a few older pictures of herself in the late stages of her pregnancy. The centerpiece in one of the pages was a photograph of Laura, big-bellied and wearing a youthful smile, and a little 5-year-old Faye, curiously resting her ear on her mommy's tummy. The image was priceless, and it was one that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. "Faye and I put this together, actually," she said, "when she was very little." It made sense to me. Faye was one of the most talented arts and crafts hobbyists I had ever known. "So, what happened?" I asked. Laura looked over her shoulder down the hall. She obviously feared that Faye would wake up. "His name was Christopher," she said, tears welling up in her eyes as she spoke. She turned the page and there was a photo of Laura undergoing an ultrasound, giving the thumbs up. "He was a stillborn, a little over a month before the due date." I had no idea what to say. I felt that saying "I'm sorry" was too empty, but I just remained silent. "Placenta abruption," she continued. "It's rare, but it happens." She scooted closer to me on the couch and set the scrapbook on my lap, then grabbed my wrist. She said, "Felix, Faye doesn't remember any of this. We have never, ever spoken about it." I asked her how that could be possible, given that she was certainly old enough to remember an event like this. Laura explained that the emergency occurred while Greg was out with the girls. The paramedics rushed Laura to the hospital, but the baby couldn't be saved. When she and Greg finally decided to break the news to their daughters that Christopher had died, Becca was heartbroken. But Faye didn't react. It was almost as if they were telling her something that simply didn't register. Laura would say, "Do you understand that Christopher is never coming home?" And Faye would respond, "Yes, Mommy," with a blank expression. This apparently went on for weeks. Faye would occasionally ask about Christopher, as if he would be visiting soon. Then suddenly, she'd not remember anything about him, as if he never existed. She began to act out in school. She would throw violent tantrums for no reason. A child psychologist warned that Faye was not handling the situation well, so Laura and Greg decided to spend several days up at the cabin with the girls, in hopes of separating Faye's mind from the heavy event. And that's when it happened. Whatever lives in the forest up there, up in the trees or down in the hole, took notice of Faye. It wanted to learn more about her, but her little brain shut down in terror whenever it got too close. Laura said after that day, Faye never spoke of Christopher again, and seems completely unaware that he ever existed. Suddenly, Faye's voice erupted from behind us. She was standing in the hallway, perhaps for a long time. I slammed shut the scrapbook and the air just went out of the room. There was an agonizingly long moment of stillness, during which all of us exchanged surprised looks. "What's that?" she finally asked, pointing to the scrapbook on my lap. I was useless, a deer in the headlights. Laura got up and got in between me and Faye, giving her a hug and asked her how she was feeling. She said that they needed to talk, but Faye pushed her aside and walked over to the couch. Her fiery eyes locked on the scrapbook, and she didn't even blink. She reached down and opened it. The page she revealed, it had a colorful cutout of the number 5. It was one of the final pages of the scrapbook. Her jaw trembled and tears instantly welled up in her eyes. A look of excruciating pain fell over her face. She began hyperventilating. Laura rounded the couch and tried to assuage her, but Faye slapped her hand away and grabbed the scrapbook. She raced off into the bedroom. She cried for hours, never letting us in. I spent the rest of the day alone. Faye never emerged from the bedroom, and wouldn't speak to me when I knocked. So I played Overwatch to distract myself from the horrible knot of stress in my stomach. Meanwhile, texting my best friends Richard and Jason regarding the new developments. When I got up to get a drink, I heard the bedroom door click. Faye was ready to let me in. She was sitting on the bed with the scrapbook in her lap when I pushed the door open. I said as gently as I could, "You want to talk about it?" Her face was streaked with hundreds of tears. Her skin was pale, her eyes were lifeless. I had never seen her in such a state. I considered calling the paramedics in fear that she might hurt herself or me. All she said was, "I remember now." I stood there in the doorway, afraid to move. I wasn't sure exactly how Faye would react to the knowledge that I had been conspiring with her mother about their secret past. "Mom and I spent all summer getting the nursery set up," she said, tracing a finger over one of the photos. "Dad was so excited he was finally going to have a son. So we did a sports theme." I walked over to the bed and sat down, quiet as a lamb, trying not to trigger another explosion. Faye kept her hands pressed on the scrapbook, as though she was feeling for a pulse. The colorful number 5 rested at the center of the page, laid over several photos at once. There was a baseball mural painted on the wall with 5 players, and another, a toddler onesie, in the design of a basketball jersey. It too displayed the number 5. Faye started crying again and choked out, "Christopher was going to be the 5th member of our family." We talked for a long time. Well, mostly Faye talked. I just quietly watched her face in awe as the deluge of ancient memories flooded her mind. Sometimes she could barely speak. Other times she just shook her head and said that it was all a dream. Her denial rose and fell in waves, and then she grasped at the faded images in her head and tried to describe them to me with this great strain. There was a tomb. A tomb had been unearthed, and Faye was excavating it despite all the pain it wrought on her. All I could do was hold her hand through it. That night, I made some of Nathan's tea again, and we both drank it. Faye fell asleep, and I stayed awake watching Netflix. Just as I was about to shut off the computer, I heard a rustling outside, and then the voice of a little girl. She said, "It's Faye. I can't see you. Who are you?" I walked down the hall and peered out the blinds in the living room. A dark figure walked right past the window, scaring me half to death. It came from our backyard, and no doubt it had been standing outside our bedroom window. I ran down the hall and grabbed my sweats and shoes. Then I bolted out the door and looked all around the property. There, across the road, standing under a street lamp, was this man. His body glowed in the pale yellow light, but his face was totally black. He looked nearly 7 feet tall, and one of his shoulders was noticeably higher than the other one. His posture was rigid and reminiscent of Faye when she sleptwalked. I knew exactly who it was. I can't explain what prompted me to run after him, but I wanted to grab this thing by his neck and beat him to death with my bare hands. Perhaps it was because I was so tired of my fear and it just hadn't kicked in yet. Or perhaps I had just had enough. But instead of clawing me to death right there in the street, the figure turned and ran. I chased after him, screaming at the top of my lungs, "Stay the fuck away from my house and my family!" The thing moved very fast, but it limped with a freakish gait. My mind envisioned a rail-thin creature made of oily black parts, stretching on the costume of a human being and gracelessly lurching around in it. This thing was not a person. Its movements were animalistic, its strides were far too long. Its breath wheezed like the air in an old antique accordion, and the stench that it dragged behind, it stung my nose. It smelled like wildfire. "No woods for you to fuck around in out here!" I screamed. Lights flicked on in all the houses around me. I chased the figure. It practically galloped. It was always 20 feet ahead of me. I chased it down for 2 blocks. It rounded a few turns and finally bounded over a chain-link fence into the community park, where there were no lights. I couldn't see the damn thing, so I had to run all the way around to the other side to get in. The only thing I could see was a silhouette. The figure stood there in an empty field, shrouded by the night, gazing up at the moon. The silver outline of its body indicated that it was facing away from me. One of its hands twitched wildly. The other one gnarled up like driftwood. The sight of it out here, so far from help, unnerved me. I approached it still, committed to ending this nightmare tonight, one way or another. My courage evaporated about 10 feet away from the creature, when it issued a growl that I can't even describe. It was so deep, I felt it in my ribcage as I heard it. I stopped in my tracks, but I still managed to say, "You will never take her. You will never have Faye. You will leave us alone forever. Go back to your fucking mountain and bury yourself in a mine." It growled again, then gurgled up a wet laugh. "What is your name?" It asked in my voice. It had been practicing. It was almost perfect now. May I come in? How do you carry on a conversation with an entity that is basically a demonic parrot? I said much louder than before, "You will leave us alone and go back to your mountain. Faye will never be yours." The imposter emitted the shriek of an infant. The sound startled me. It felt so wrong coming out of the form of such a large man. Then it said, in the voice of a child, "You go down in the hole. That's where he'll put you." "Look at me, you piece of shit," I said, trying to sound menacing. But in reality, I'm a coward, and most people can sense it. So there's little doubt that the imposter knew it too. Then it said something that I didn't expect. The sound threw me off so much my head spun. "Tell me about the child," it said. Nathan's voice wafted gently from its throat. "Tell me about the child." Before I could speak, the imposter whirled around and squared off with me. There are no words to express the combination of shock and instant despair that I felt. My knees came straight out from under me. I fell onto the wet grass. Staring down at me, boring into me with lidless eyes, was the face of Nathan, my friend, my protector, the son of a man who had given his life to help me. Now, his skin was hard and bruised, his scalp flayed, his eyes tormented. He had been stretched over the skull that didn't quite fit, in a body that rattled with loose, collected bones. A slimy black liquid dribbled down the arms. Maybe it was blood. It was too dark to tell. It spoke in the phrase of a language of Nathan's people, the same one Nathan had uttered over the phone that made us sick. I began vomiting profusely and laid there on the ground. "Tell me about the child," it said once more, then smiled. The lips spread and stretched into an expression of malevolent joy, bearing the rotting maw of a long dead wolf. Nathan's calm voice seeped out of it. "Let me speak to the one who followed you home." I gasped for air, but I couldn't command my body to move. The creature took a few steps towards me, and I slammed my eyes shut, expecting those hideous fangs to go into my neck. Instead, I heard its footsteps approach, and then recede into the opposite direction. When I opened my eyes, the imposter had stepped over me and was just walking away. It was already in the distance, moving quickly. Back towards my neighborhood, towards my house. "Followed you home," it repeated, echoing into the cold night air. "Followed you home. Followed you home." This post will be the remainder of the last update, which I broke into two pieces. When I was 3 years old, my parents and I went with some family friends to a cabin up in the mountains. One of the other family's kids was sick with some sort of flu. A few nights in, I came down with it too. I threw up everywhere, all over. My father was so grossed out that his reaction made me cry, a lot. My mom had to kick him out of the room while she took care of me. His horrified expression is imprinted on my mind forever. It taught me that there's something terribly wrong with being sick. I'm 28 years old now, and I spent most of my years being absolutely paranoid about throwing up. Emetophobia controls so much of a person's life. It makes you afraid to share someone's drink, eat without washing your hands, afraid of getting on roller coasters, afraid to fly in planes, afraid to try new things. But at some point after decades with the phobia, you almost forget what causes you to regard all of these things with fear. The mere possibility of vomiting becomes subconscious. You don't even think about it anymore. You're just virtually afraid of anything that could cause it. And yet you have no immediate explanation as to why you are afraid. You just are. Although the possibility no longer lingers at the precipice of my conscious thoughts, the imposter, he found it. He went straight for the core of my being and saw what terrifies me the most. He brought it out and he used it against me. Repeating Nathan's spiritual purge chant didn't just disable me there in the field. It was a reminder of the creature's remarkable power to turn my own flawed humanity against me. A reminder that it was planning to make me suffer in the most personal ways. The imposter was designing a personal hell for me, and it was nearly ready to drag me down into it. And so, the world collapsed on me. I laid there on the ground, puking my guts out, knowing that my fiancée was asleep and unguarded in bed, while this terrible thing strode toward her in the dark. It called out her name in every voice that could be familiar to her. It said things that would make her happy. It begged for help. It mimicked the cries of children. It capitalized on her innate motherly instincts, on her buried memories, and on the vulnerability of her in an unconscious state. All I could do was stagger around and wait for the thrum of my death-gripped heart to subside. After a few moments, the moonlight poured back into my vision, lighting the way out of the park. My pulse recovered from its frenzy, and the numbness in my limbs faded away. The taste in my mouth, for once, didn't paralyze me. I tore through the streets to get back to my house. I had no plan. There were a lot of lights on in the houses on my street. Many of my neighbors had likely heard me screaming. I had hoped that this meant that the imposter would think twice about moving in the open beneath all of their watchful gazes. The front door of my house was wide open, and it was pitch black inside. I shouted for Faye, but I couldn't find her. The bed was empty and disheveled, as though she had jumped out of it, or had been dragged out of it. A faint sound caught my attention. The sound of crying. I struggled to determine where it came from, and after looking in every room, I realized that it was coming from outside. I stepped out of the sliding glass door in our bedroom that leads to the backyard. The sound grew louder, but mixed with shuffling noises. There's a walkway that runs along the side of our house and connects the backyard to the front. And there, in the darkness, was Faye. She was sleepwalking in the most unusual manner I had ever seen. She stood up high on the balls of her feet. That was the same as before. But she was bent over at the waist. Her hair and arms dangled lifelessly towards the ground. And she shuffled towards the street where I had first seen the shadowy figure. Faye's neck was craned in such a way that I could see her face swaying outside of her left thigh. Two mournful eyes peered up at me from it. Her lips trembled as she cried. I couldn't tell if she was conscious or not. She mumbled something, but with her cries I couldn't make out what she was saying. I wrapped my arms around her waist and literally carried her inside. She clawed at me and landed a tiger palm on my crotch. Just as we careened into the living room, a police cruiser drove past. Its flashlights traced across the houses. I gently closed the door and peered out of the window. It took me a moment to see it, but in the tree in our front yard, the dark form was crouched on the thickest branch. I yanked the curtains down over the blinds. Faye and we stayed awake for the rest of the night until dawn. We heard footsteps on the roof and in the attic, but no voices. On 2 occasions, someone gently knocked on the door, and once on the sliding glass door in the back. But we remained in the living room. We communicated only through pen and paper, and prevented each other from nodding off and dreaming about the scrapbook or Christopher. The last thing she wrote was, "Got an idea. Explain tomorrow." At about 6 a.m., my cell phone buzzed on the table. It had been quiet for a few hours now. Faye and I were almost done with the second Lord of the Rings movie. When I grabbed the phone, I was surprised to see that it was a ranger from Pikes Peak. His name is Greg, same as Faye's dad, so I just refer to him by his title in these posts. We hadn't spoken in a while, and I immediately feared that this call was the confirmation of the grim likelihood that Nathan was dead. He skipped all the pleasantries and said, You better sit down." A nauseous fear crept up my throat when he said that. I shook my head and replied, "Just tell me, just tell me." Static began to form in my peripheral vision, which happens when I'm feeling faint. If it grows to cover my entire view, I pass out. The ranger cleared his throat and tried to speak with some composure, but I can hear in his voice that he had been crying. He said, "We got a call from Nathan's relatives. She said that he had been missing for a few days. They thought he went camping with his buddies, but next thing, none of them knew where he was. On my routine in the morning, I dropped by Faye's folks' cabin." There was a long silence that told me everything I needed to know. But then, the ranger said more. "The cops are everywhere here now. The whole mountain is shut down. They've still got T-Way listed as a missing person, but now they're out hunting for a body. Like, they mean it this time. Looking for a murderer too, but..." I interrupted him and demanded to know why. There was no way I could hide my frantic anxiety any longer. The ranger said, "Something's happening up here, at the cabin. They did something to him. I don't know how to tell you." He paused again, struggling to hold back tears. I crumpled to the couch when he spoke. The news singed every nerve on my body. Pain radiated up from my stomach across every limb. My scalp tickled. The static in my vision grew. "I need to know," I said. The ranger insisted that the details were unnecessary, but I begged him. Now, what I'm about to tell you is paraphrasing of what the ranger said. Some of the info might change as the Denver coroner performs the official autopsy, but this is what we know. The bedroom window of the cabin was forced open from the outside, but also the front door was unlocked and slightly open when the ranger arrived. The bedroom door was locked from the inside. It appeared that two people, one of them being Nathan, had been staying inside the cabin for 2 or 3 nights. Nathan's satellite phone was found inside. My number was the last one that he dialed. It was unclear whether or not Nathan was present at the cabin when we spoke, when he promised me that he wouldn't go to the cabin. There was a buck knife jammed into one of the walls. There were many unusual symbols and words that had been carved all down the hallway, leading from the living room to the bedroom. There were words in Hopi, the Native American language that Nathan's people spoke, and Zuni, a language that they did not. The words haven't yet been translated. There was a carving of a large dream catcher outside of the bedroom door, and non-lethal amounts of blood spattered everywhere on the carpet and lower wall opposite of said door. On the inside of the bedroom, there were small marks everywhere, as though someone had been pounding on it. The ranger and sheriff speculate that Nathan sat on the floor in the hallway for several hours, perhaps even an entire day. Someone was in the bedroom, but the door remained locked. It's entirely possible that they had a long conversation. At no point was there electricity or heat functioning in the cabin, because it had been shut off after I was rescued on my second visit. This meant however long Nathan stayed, he remained in the dark in the freezing weather each night. 2 pairs of tracks were found leaving the cabin, one from the bedroom window, and the other one from the front door, heading into the forest out back. The tracks joined together, indicating that the 2 people walked side by side into the woods. Nathan's body was recovered by the ranger dogs approximately a quarter mile in. He was buried upside down, with his legs erupting from the soil at the knee. Upon exhumation, it was discovered that Nathan's face and scalp had been flayed or mutilated. There were deep lacerations on his back which appeared to be from some kind of claw, and the carvings on his arm looked self-inflicted. The official cause of death, however, was suffocation. He had been buried alive. Oh, and everything in the cellar was gone. It was completely empty. I've never come so close to ending my own life. The guilt and horror I felt at hearing the ranger's words are still ineffable, so I won't try and document them. Somehow, I convinced myself that there would be time to grieve in the future, and even for the acts of penance, but right now, I needed to focus on Faye. After all, she still might end up like Nathan and T-Way if we don't figure out what to do. A few days pass with no strange activity beyond a voice here and there. I was hesitant to let Faye sleep for fear that she would dream about her little brother and give the imposter exactly what it was looking for. But she explained to me her idea, a plan to get rid of the creature once and for all. And for the first time in months, I actually felt a glimmer of hope. We kept drinking Nathan's tea after discerning that it was doing no actual harm. And Faye spent days furiously drawing and journaling, texting her mom and sister. I called Angela, the Shoshone woman, and requested that she come visit with her hypnotist friend to speak with Faye again, and to bless our new home. I also made as large of a donation as I could to T-Way and Nathan's community to help cover the cost of their funeral ceremonies. In my spare time in the evening, I wrote a letter to both of them. I intend to read it at their burial place someday. Each night, Faye went to bed crying. She had definitely entered some kind of mourning process, long delayed by years of denial, and now I bore witness to the lifelong impact of her loss. Never in my life have I seen a human in so much pain. But Faye assured me that she would be alright, and that I should put some faith in her. I silently obliged, because I trust her more than anyone in the world. She knows herself, and I put my faith in that. One night, I snuck into the bedroom and retrieved Faye's drawings. She had produced several pictures of her own nightmares, of memories from her childhood, of a young man that looked like her. I believe he is Christopher, or at least how Faye imagined he would look. He had survived and grown up. She wrote all kinds of things around the drawings, mostly detailed descriptions of the images, sometimes stories of when she was young. She wrote her brother's name 12 times. She even drew a family portrait that included herself at the age of 5, holding a smiling baby. On the 5th night after the incident in the park, Angela and her hypnotist friend arrived. As I've mentioned before, I haven't given the hypnotist's name because I don't want you to have to keep track of too many people. Faye informed our guest of what she believed could get rid of the entity for good. I went outside and set the drawings under a tree in our front yard, where I had last seen the shadowy figure. Then we got Faye comfortable and set her up on the couch. Fortunately for us, Faye has the remarkable ability to fall asleep at any time, any place. So all we had to do was dim the lights in the house. I made a pasta dish for everyone, and within a half hour, she was out cold. This time, she didn't drink Nathan's tea. For a long time, Angela, the hypnotist, and I sat around the kitchen table over coffee and ice cream. We kept our voices low and discussed the recent events related to the cabin, waiting for the imposter to show up. The hypnotist was especially interested in the dream catchers, and wanted to know who made them. I told her that I didn't have any idea, and that at first I thought the entity itself created them. After speaking with you seem to be more insightful than I am, I started to believe that someone had summoned or was controlling the entity with the original dreamcatcher. Then, when I broke it, I realized it was protecting me. She said, "Do you think it's possible that one of her family members created it? Or the ranger? Do you trust him?" Many people have speculated that Nathan and T-Way were not honest with me, or who they said they were, but I honestly hadn't considered that the ranger himself could be behind all of this. I conceded that it was a possibility. Faye spoke a few times in her sleep. She laughed and said things like, "Do you need help with that?" and "The hell are you doing?" After she said the name of her boss, I realized that she was dreaming about work. We waited until about midnight, but by then, no activity had occurred. No sounds were coming from outside. Angela woke Faye up and said, "We need to take a more direct approach." The two women propped Faye up in the bed, hospital style, and began to hum a beautiful song. Angela would intermittently speak in her native tongue and trace line with her fingers across Faye's forehead. The hypnotist occasionally raised her hands in the air and then touched Faye's shoulders. After several minutes, my fiancée went limp. Her head slumped back on the couch and her arm dangled to the floor. Finally, she opened her eyes, which were now rolled back in her head. She began breathing rhythmically. The hypnotist said, "Who are you?" She replied simply, "Faye." "Are you alone?" "I'm with you." "Who else is here?" "Angela, Felix, Erica," her boss. The hypnotist corrected Faye and said, "Erica isn't here, it's just us four." Faye looked puzzled for a moment and then said, "Okay." Angela joined the conversation and touched Faye's arm. She asked, "The one who follows you, the one who calls out in the night, where is he now? Is he here?" Faye craned her head from side to side, like she was emptying waters from her ears, and she replied, "No." "Well, where is he?" Faye sat motionless for a whole minute, then finally said, "Across the dark." The hypnotist said, "Faye, can you call out to him? Can you ask him to come here?" She remained silent. The hypnotist asked it again. Faye said, "No," forcefully. Angela said, "Honey, we can't get rid of him unless you bring him here." Faye began to whimper. Her mouth trembled. Then she uttered the voice of a small child, "Please, no." Goosebumps rippled across my arms as I sat at the table watching this. Angela implored her and Faye began to cry. "You have to call out to him," the hypnotist repeated. "Tell him where you are." Faye slowly rocked back and forth and tried to reach up to protect herself, but the weight of her hypnotic state kept her in place. Suddenly, her body went stiff and her eyes rolled forward. They landed squarely on me. Then over my shoulder and focused on something 1,000 miles behind me. Her mouth opened slightly and a gurgling sound came up from her throat. She said in a wet, masculine voice, "Watch you, watch you." Faye leapt off the couch and shuddered as though she was trying to throw something off of her back. Her body stayed rigid, and she turned and faced away from us. Every joint in her limbs popped with sickening cracks. She bent her head back and stared up at that place in the ceiling where the wall met in front of her. Then she balled her fists up tightly. Again, she said, "Watch you, watch you, watch you." The hypnotist and Angela were now standing, gathering around Faye to prevent her from hurting herself or dashing off into the night. I played safety a few feet away, trying to be ready for anything. The hypnotist said, "Faye, tell us where she is." She breathed hard through gritted teeth and then forced out the word, "Bedroom." We all turned and looked behind us down that dark hall. The hypnotist wrapped her hand around Faye's forehead from behind and started whispering in her ear. I turned and quietly moved down the hall towards the bedroom. As I approached it, I could hear the sliding glass door open to the yard. When I stepped into the bedroom, a cold breeze was blowing. The glass door on the opposite wall was wide open. I looked around to make sure I wasn't about to get ambushed, and then I approached the door. The backyard light has a motion sensor that automatically activates when something moves. It was off. The yard was dark. However, at the far end of the yard, I could make out the shape of a man. The same figure I had seen a week earlier. The one I had made the dire mistake of chasing after. This time the figure was even larger than before. It appeared to stand at roughly 7 feet, and it faced away as always. Its head cocked toward the moon, its hand laid pressed on its side, fist balled, tightly clenching tiny pieces of paper. Faye's drawings. It growled, "Whoa my, whoa my." I slid the door shut as fast as I could and locked it. Then I raced back to the living room. Faye was now sitting on the couch, head still craned up towards the ceiling. Angela and the hypnotist were trying to wake her. They implored her to wake up, but it seemed as though she was struggling to return. Outside, a voice howled. It sounded like a little girl crying out for her mother. Another voice erupted, Laura's, shouting, "Greg, we need to take her to the hospital." Faye began to convulse, so the two women clutched her tightly and begged her to wake up. An infant began to shriek in the yard, and then it moved down the side of our house to the front door. There was a loud, slow knock, followed by more voices. The knock repeated over and over and over. Becca's voice called out from behind the door, "Faye, where are you? Help! Please help!" At last, Faye sucked in a huge breath and leaned back on the couch. She had returned to a normal position. She stood up frantically trying to collect herself. The pounding on the door grew louder as the voices began to overlap, as though several people were standing outside the door crying for help in the night. She breathlessly said, "It's here. It's here," and looked over at me. In Faye's eyes I saw uncertainty and terror, mirrors of my own state. But then, a look of conviction fell over her face. The fear seemed to evaporate right off of it. A man began to cry outside the door, and at sudden Greg's voice, "He was my child too, Laura, my son. Do you think a weekend in the goddamn mountains would make me forget?" Faye gasped. The words were so perfectly clear that I believed he was the one at the door. "Don't you fucking dare," Laura's voice shouted. "Let her forget, just let her forget. This doesn't have to be a burden on her too." Faye burst into tears and wobbled to the door. She rested her face against it and reached for the knob. The shrieks of a baby echoed throughout the house, followed by a little girl saying, "What's your name? I can't see you. It's Faye. Faye." I watched my fiancé collapse onto the floor in despair. Angela and the hypnotist took a step forward, but Faye put her hand in the air to halt them. She sat on the ground and leaned back against the door, and brushed the strawberry blonde locks out of her eyes. The door knocked again. My own voice followed, saying, "May I come in? It's freezing out here. Another storm is coming tonight." "I have to tell you something," Faye said, gently knocking on the door. "I know what you really want." All of the voices fell silent at once. Only an uneasy breathing remained. "I had a baby brother," she said. "His name was Christopher. He was number 5. The breathing cut out. Faye knocked on the door again. After a moment, something knocked back. "I remember now," she continued. "I couldn't remember for years, or I guess I didn't want to. It's easy for me to just pretend things never happened. Some kids make things exist, friends, monsters, places, but I made Christopher not exist. That way I didn't have to lose him. His death was just make-believe." A long, slow scratching sound resonated from the door. The thing outside was dragging its claws across the wood. It was drawing a picture. Faye put her palm on the door, feeling the weak vibration from the scratching. For a long time, the number was all I could remember. I knew it meant something more, but every time I thought about it, my whole body would hurt. I would feel sick, and then I would just fall asleep. Or if I was dreaming, I would just wake up. I always knew it meant something more. The doorknob rattled, a wet, clunking sound emitting from it. The imposter was chewing on it from the other side. The clatter of 100 jagged teeth rose in a vile symphony across our living room. He was a stillborn. Do you know what that is? He died inside of my mom. All this time, I've avoided burying Christopher, but you've helped me finally realize that it's time to lay him to rest. "Faye, come hold him," Becca's voice called out. "He falls asleep so fast when you have him. You want her to be your new mommy, Caleb?" The scratching noises persisted. Faye wiped the tears out of her eyes and took a deep breath. "Now you know everything. I wanted you to know." The chorus of voices ran out in the night again. An infant screamed, a toddler cried. Greg, Laura, and Becca, T-Way, Nathan, and the Ranger all spoke at once. Decades of pain washed through the door. Words of anguish, sorrowful cries drowned all the other sounds out in the room. Angela, the hypnotist, and I exchanged terrified glances. But Faye remained motionless at the door. She was staring up into my eyes. She didn't blink. The knocking on the door swelled to a violent pounding. The entity used every possible trick it could. It tried to hit her right where the wounds were fresh, tried to tear open the oldest scars. But Faye never budged. She held her ground emotionally and never took her eyes off of me. They were filled with a knowing calm, as if to say, enough. When the imposter got no response, it stomped the front door in the nearby window. It towered over us, and it blocked out the moonlight that lit the drapes. A huge shadow fell across Faye as she sat there unmoved. Whoa my. It growled. Faye's lips quivered, but she said nothing. A titanic scream erupted from the creature, and then it slapped the glass with an open hand. The sound shook our home, and a lightning bolt of terror hit me in the pit of my stomach. But Faye didn't react. She didn't even flinch. And then the entity said something that I didn't expect. Instead of assuming the voice of someone we knew, it spoke in several that I did not recognize. It spoke only one labored sentence, but each word was uttered in a different tongue. I walked 1,000 years across the dark to find you. A small part of me wanted to just run away screaming, but I was so afraid that my legs wouldn't even move. The finality, the longing of what it said was incomprehensibly dreary. I totally lost my nerve. That moment, a thing I expected even less happened. The shadow receded across the window, coloring Faye's face with the silver dim kiss of the moonlight. Sullen footsteps lurched across our yard and then vanished into the backdrops of cricket songs. After a while, we were alone. All three of us looked down at Faye. A relieved smile spread across her face. She wasn't crying anymore. It's been several days since the imposter left. It returned once, only to sing this morose lullaby. Soul miadu. I'm a naked soul, miadu. Faye slept through the entire thing. It didn't even mention her. My fiancée has been sleeping well ever since that night. She hasn't talked at all, and certainly hasn't sleptwalked. In fact, she hasn't even been tossing and turning like she normally does. It's almost as if a dreadful weight had been lifted from her shoulders. During the day she cries and she cuddles with me and asks to talk about her childhood. She Skypes with her mom and her sister too. They cry. I have shed many tears with her, and for her loss. But I understand now what she did. Faye never mentioned Christopher, only the number 5. As a child, she repressed the memory and the pain of his death, and thus forgot about him. The number became the lockbox in which he was hidden. It was the coffin that she buried him in, and she buried him so deep within herself that she couldn't even remember him in her nightmares. That's why the entity never fully understood what she was hiding. That's why it never gained full access to her. Faye's lifelong sleep disturbances were her mind's admittance to keeping the welling pain repressed. But by talking in her sleep, she inadvertently got dark attention to herself. If you speak long enough into the void, someone's bound to start listening. Someone or something heard Faye's pain and saw the weakness. It saw the cracks in her heart as a passage to her soul, and so it chose her. The imposter became transfixed with my fiancée, not because she was an easy target, because she was a monolithic puzzle box of torment, a challenge, a worthy opportunity. I remarked early on in these stories that one of the things I love most about Faye is her intelligence. She has an artistic creativity that allows her to see things in a way that I don't. She realized that the imposter could tug on her puppet strings by delving into the darkest parts of her mind and all the hidden places where there were weapons to be used against her, to weaken her, to wear her down. But instead of burying her secrets deeper, she unearthed them and brought them into the light by moving Christopher and the number that represented him from her subconscious into her waking thoughts. Faye unleashed a tidal wave of forgotten pain upon herself. But also, she took away what the imposter wanted power over her for. She cut her own puppet strings. There was nothing left for the creature to grab onto, so it left. I've also shed tears for my friends, Nathan and T-Way. Perhaps I can never convey the warmth of their personalities and the sincerity of their hearts, but I trusted them entirely. I don't think they had anything to do with the foul thing that stalked my fiancé for all these years. Their deaths are mortal wounds on my heart, and I will always carry the agony of their loss. I want it to hurt, as a permanent reminder. They had given so much to me and asked nothing in return, only that I preserved the goodness of their people in my memory. By writing about their altruism and sacrifices, I am trying to fulfill that purpose. May their spirits live on in that sacred land that they protected. We may never know for sure who built the dream catcher at our cabin, or the one in the tree outside of my home. Right now, I believe that they were built by different people who lived on Pikes Peak. Some of them want to protect fools like me who venture into the mountain without understanding its significance to the Indians living there. Others perhaps wish to harm them. Maybe even Angela herself built one for us. Maybe you can't tell the person they're designed to protect, or it won't work. Faye's ring was also a topic of heated debate, whether or not it was cursed, and what should be done with it, etc. For now, my fiancé does not wish to part with it. She may consider it if something else happens. It's still a precious family heirloom, and a symbol of my devotion, whatever taint it may carry. I guess what I mean is, we don't have all the answers, and the unfortunate thing is that we may never. The true nature of the entity and full explanation of what happened to us might remain a mystery. But in time, I do believe we'll come to understand more about this terrible ordeal. We plan to go back out to Colorado in a few weeks and spend some time with Faye's parents, and to pay our deepest respects to T-Way and Nathan's community. And to witness the bulldozing of the cabin. Whatever secrets it still hides, let them be buried beneath the rubble and the snows of decades to come. Guys, this is probably one of my favorite stories I've ever narrated, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I have. It is truly a good story, and like I said, go buy the book from the author. I bought one for my mom and my grandma, so I hope they enjoy it too. So now it's time to thank the $10 and above patrons. Dan R., Paul Z., Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, Chaos X, JY, Pyromancer, Hayden MH, and Ethan A. Guys, I cannot thank you enough. And all the $5 patrons down below, also can't thank you enough. If you want access to some Patreon-only content and have your name read off or put in the description, please consider becoming a patron. And again, if you are a patron, please suggest me some stories you would like for the Patreon-only stuff. Again, I really hope you enjoy this. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you're subscribed. Follow me on Twitter. That's all in the description. Thank you. This post will be the remainder of the last update, which I broke into 2 pieces. When I was 3 years old, my parents and I went with some family friends to a cabin up in the mountains. One of the other family's kids was sick with some sort of flu. A few nights in, I came down with it too. I threw up everywhere, all over. My father was so grossed out that his reaction made me cry, a lot. My mom had to kick him out of the room while she took care of me. His horrified expression is imprinted on my mind forever. It taught me that there's something terribly wrong with being sick. I'm 28 years old now, and I spent most of my years being absolutely paranoid about throwing up. Emetophobia controls so much of a person's life. It makes you afraid to share someone's drink, eat without washing your hands, afraid of getting on roller coasters, afraid to fly in planes, afraid to try new things. But at some point after decades with the phobia, you almost forget what causes you to regard all of these things with fear. The mere possibility of vomiting becomes subconscious. You don't even think about it anymore. You're just virtually afraid of anything that could cause it. And yet you have no immediate explanation as to why you are afraid. You just are. Although the possibility no longer lingers at the precipice of my conscious thoughts, the imposter, he found it. He went straight for the core of my being and saw what terrifies me the most. He brought it out and he used it against me. Repeating Nathan's spiritual purge chant didn't just disable me there in the field. It was a reminder of the creature's remarkable power to turn my own flawed humanity against me. A reminder that it was planning to make me suffer in the most personal ways. The imposter was designing a personal hell for me, and it was nearly ready to drag me down into it. And so, the world collapsed on me. I laid there on the ground, puking my guts out, knowing that my fiancée was asleep and unguarded in bed, while this terrible thing strode toward her in the dark. It called out her name in every voice that could be familiar to her. It said things that would make her happy. It begged for help. It mimicked the cries of children. It capitalized on her innate motherly instincts, on her buried memories, and on the vulnerability of her in an unconscious state. All I could do was stagger around and wait for the thrum of my death-grip heart to subside. After a few moments, the moonlight poured back into my vision, lighting the way out of the park. My pulse recovered from its frenzy, and the numbness in my limbs faded away. The taste in my mouth, for once, didn't paralyze me. I tore through the streets to get back to my house. I had no plan. There were